PJ Fleck, what do you do for an encore? Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, breaking down the schedules in the Power 5. We have started our journey in the Big Ten. We're almost done with our first of the 5 Power 5 conferences. Minnesota, of course, 10-2 in the regular season last year, finishing in the top 10 in the country with an 11th win against Auburn in the Outback Bowl as a clear touchdown underdog. PJ Fleck won the final 3 games of the regular season in 2018 to lift the Gophers to postseason play at 6-6. They demolished Georgia Tech 34-10. That was a foreshadowing of things to come in 2019. Does the ascension continue? It's going to be difficult for the Gophers. Let's see, though, in the non-conference, they once again have a pretty light touch with Florida Atlantic, Tennessee Tech, and then an interesting date at home against BYU in Week 4. In amongst that September schedule, of course, a key date at home against Iowa. The Gophers lost to the Hawkeyes by 1 score, going down big early, coming back to make it close. 22-19 final, they lose to the Hawkeyes, their first defeat of 2019. Let's check out the rest of the Big Ten schedule, in which Minnesota should go 3-0 non-conference. But again, BYU is going to be a difficult out, a very interesting, intriguing game for the Gophers there. And I'm not necessarily counting the Florida Atlantic game as a sure win out of the gate for Minnesota. Check out the Gophers' non-conference games against FCS and Group of 5 teams in recent seasons. I know this Minnesota edition is supposed to be better, but even last year, in a season in which they won 11 games, finished in the top 10, they struggled mightily against the FCS in the Group of 5 out of the gate. All right, then they dive into Big Ten play on the road against Maryland and Wisconsin. 2 pretty difficult assignments. The Terps were down, of course, with only 3 wins last year, but they bludgeoned Minnesota 2 years ago, 42-13, and Minnesota won that game big against the Terps last year by 6 touchdowns. The game at Wisconsin, of course, is a revenge factor game. Big rivalry game always for Paul Bunyan's Axe, as Minnesota had the Big Ten Western Division Championship in sight and lost the final game of the season at home against Wisconsin by 31 points. Michigan, Illinois, Michigan State, Purdue, Northwestern, Nebraska. So obviously the back-to-back against Wisconsin and Michigan is key. The rugged test there, followed by Illinois and Michigan State on the road. Not necessarily gimme wins, but games in which if things play out the way we expect, Minnesota will be a substantial favorite against the Illini and against Mel Tucker's Michigan State team. Purdue and Northwestern at home. Again, Minnesota, games in which we would expect them to win, but let's not necessarily crown Minnesota as perennial contenders yet. It was one season, a very good season, and I think the one component that validates it is the conclusion of 2018. We saw it coming in 2019, and PJ Fleck and his coaching staff fulfilled the promise of November of 2018 throughout the season in 2019. Interesting date against Nebraska. Typically, Minnesota concludes its season with a rivalry game against Wisconsin. The Big Ten changing things up as Nebraska has been pinned against Iowa. And the Big Ten, since Nebraska has joined the conference, has forced that into a rivalry on the final Friday of November after Thanksgiving. Now the Big Ten, for whatever reason, we may need to do some research on this, is switching things up. And they are matching up Nebraska and Minnesota. And instead it's Iowa taking on Wisconsin. So it's Minnesota at Nebraska. There could be a whole lot on the line right there. If the Huskers improve to the point that most people expect, or many people expect, that are backing Scott Frost. That's the Minnesota ledger right there. The off week comes after the Purdue game and before the closing run against Northwestern and Nebraska. That Nebraska game taking the place of the Iowa-Nebraska game also on that Friday after Thanksgiving. Interesting date there. And note that the Iowa-Minnesota game is on a Friday night as well, so the nation of college football will be watching. Minnesota coming off 10-2 and 7-2 in the Big Ten. I see a 9-3 campaign for PJ Fleck and company, 6-3. So even though that's a one-game decline in the win column, I would score that as a major, major victory for this program if they're able to stabilize at that upper echelon level and follow up 10-2 with a 9-3 regular season. My spring record projection on Minnesota will have my final prediction, of course, in August. Need to hear from you with your record projection on the Gophers, your thoughts on PJ Fleck and Minnesota's program as it stands entering 2020, right here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football.